2022 marks the 50th anniversary of the Friends of the Scituate Town Library. And for all of those years, the volunteers who comprise the Friends have raised money to provide programs, events, and activities to complement what the library offers. This program is especially meaningful to the Friends because it is in honor of our past former Vice President, Bernice Brown. Bernice Brown embodied everything that a good citizen in a democracy should be. We met more than 45 years ago at the Nonpartisan League of Women Voters, where we were both members. Beyond that, Bernice volunteered in countless campaigns. I tried to figure out how many, I lost track. And then she was brave enough to run for office herself. She served as Scituate's town clerk from 2003 to 2012, and I saw firsthand the meticulous care she took to ensure the integrity of every election. I know that she would love today's program, and I am delighted that her daughter Beth Lewis is able to join us. Alexander Keyssar is the Matthew W. Sterling Professor of History and Social Policy at Harvard University. An historian by training, he specializes in historical problems and relates them to contemporary social policy. He's the author of several books, including The Right to Vote, A Contested History of Democracy in the United States. This book won the prize for Best Book in U.S. History by both the American Historical Association and the Historical Society. In addition, it was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Times Book Award. I am honored to remember my friend Bernice Brown, and I am delighted to present Alexander Keyssar.
One advantage of being the speaker is that you're allowed to take your mask off when you're speaking. I'm sure you all know Mary Lou much better than I do, although we've become pretty close friends over the year and a half that we've been trying to arrange this event. Mary Lou first contacted me about speaking when she learned, I guess, that I started teaching a course in late January of 2021 about what had happened on January 6th, understanding what happened on January 6th. And so we actually, the first round of invitations was to have me come and talk about that. But then COVID intervened in various ways so that an invitation didn't seem very feasible and desirable for everybody. And then the subject matter shifted and people's attention got turned less to January 6th and more to things related, more or differently related to democracy and voting rights. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. But in the question period, if you have questions about what happened on January 6th, I can't claim that I have answers, but I'd be happy to discuss it. I'm going to try to see whether this works well enough with the microphone nearby so that I can actually look at my notes. So if you folks are not hearing me, raise your hands and I'll try to do what I can. So what I want to talk about, I think the starting point is to talk about the fact that there's been a lot of news about voting rights and the exercise of voting rights in this country. I mean, it's I say if you watch the mainstream media every week or so, you can see a program about voting laws changing in one state or another. Sometimes becoming more inclusive, sometimes becoming more exclusionary. There are battles going on in many state legislatures about this. And each election, it also seems to be greeted with charges of fraud on the one hand, that this election, the result is fraudulent, and voter suppression on the other. So we have there's a lot of conflict over the actual exercise of the right to vote and people's capacity to do so. what's interesting is that this clamor and conflict over the right to vote is pretty distinctively American at this point in history. This is not going on in other liberal democracies. France is having a very important election today, and there are not months and months of skirmishing over who can vote in this election ahead of time. We do see fights over the exercise of the franchise and voting rights in the countries which describe themselves increasingly as or are described as illiberal democracies, like Hungary, which in effect, where the regime in power is trying to tighten up, is trying to keep itself in power by either restricting the right to vote or there are all sorts of ways you can manipulate an electoral system without, even with the same people enfranchised, like how the system of representation works. Here, our favorite device is gerrymandering, but there are other kinds of devices in different countries. But what's remarkable, I think the place I really want to start, is with the fact that in a country whose self-image, our country, is self-image as the oldest democracy in the world, with the possible exception of Switzerland, that this issue is so embattled. Why? I mean, that's really what a lot of my work has been trying to explore in recent days, and I'm hoping that this presentation may help you to understand some of the dynamics. And what I want to do is to trace a number of historical themes and historical patterns, which are probably not familiar to you, and there's no reason why, simply as good citizens, you should know this history, some of which may seem a little bit arcane, but to trace this history and then talk about the ways in which it informs and should inform our understanding of what's going on. Let me start out first there. So, putting the first piece of the timeline up there, I'll let it sit there for a little bit while I begin talking. You'll see several timelines. This is for the period from really up to just after the Civil War. And overall, let me say something about the overall thing. The overall pattern, yes?
Can you put it in presentation mode? I can't read it. Do you know how to do that?
No, but you probably do.
Don't touch the microphone.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. It's a timeline, I told you. And when I want to switch to the next slide, can I still do it the usual way? Do I have to do something else? What? I mean, I can hit the usual thing.
I think so, try it.
Well, yeah, we're not there. Okay. I didn't realize this was going to be such a technical part. So anyway, let me articulate a couple of major themes, not all of which we will go into in detail. One is that overall, in a long sweep of things, the history of the right to vote in the United States is a history of progress. Okay, it is a history of advancement, of enlargement, but it is not a linear history. Very important. This story is not one of things keep getting better and better. It's a story of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Sometimes 1 step forward and 2 steps back. That has been the pattern since the inception. You can see one clear example there for those of you who might not have known it. Women were enfranchised in New Jersey until 1807, when they lost the right to vote. Actually, the same was true for African Americans in New Jersey. New Jersey had very weird voting rights issues. I grew up in New Jersey. So I remember the 1807 election. And the second overarching theme, there long have been and remain tensions between the policies and the powers of the federal government and those of the states. And it's a big theme here. Third, nearly all major advances in democratic rights in American history have occurred during or just after wars. That's not a policy recommendation for how to become more democratic, but it's a sobering observation about our history. And fourth, reactions and contractions, reactions to expansion and contractions of the right to vote have generally resulted from a reluctance to allow working class people, poor people, and ethnic minorities to vote. So let's begin the story with so let me sort of go back and flesh out some of the story, and you may know much of this or maybe not. Let's see whether this works. Okay, good. Oh yeah, I like to leave the jackass story. I will explain that in a minute. So a question for you. Where in the U.S. Constitution is the right to vote? No constitutional scholars in the room?
It's not in there.
That's right. That's the correct answer. You must be a ringer. That's correct. The Constitution makes no mention of a right to vote, the U.S. Constitution, either in the text itself or in the Bill of Rights, okay, which is passed immediately after and linked to ratification of the Constitution. The only allusion to the franchise in the Constitution is that it says that everybody can vote for members of the House of Representatives who can vote for the most numerous branch of each state legislature. Okay? So, in effect, it says, voting for the House of Representatives, the only federal election at the outset, right? Electors choose president, we'll get to that in a while, and senators are elected by state legislatures at the outset. And so basically the right to vote is left to the states. Now, why was it left to the states? Not for any particular reasons of principle. It was left to the states because by the time they were writing the Constitution in 1787, every state already had its own franchise requirement of one sort or another. Some places actually did permit African Americans to vote. New Jersey permitted women to vote. But mostly it had to do with whether there were property requirements to vote or tax-paying requirements to vote, and what those property requirements would look like. For example, in some states, which many states were largely agricultural, the requirement was an acreage requirement. Elsewhere, it was something to give a monetary value. So every state had their own set of rules. And the framers of the Constitution, and they did talk about this in Philadelphia, the framers worried that if they adopted a national rule, a national franchise requirement, that there were some states that would really get annoyed and not ratify the Constitution as a consequence. So what we did was to create a decentralized framework for voting rights, not because the framers thought this would be a good thing for the long term, but it had to do with the politics of constitutional ratification in the 1780s. And it had nothing to do with principle. But this decision is why most franchise laws, most laws affecting the right to vote, to this day are state laws and not federal laws. Although, as we'll see, the structure of voting rights law and of voting rights in the country is that the states do their thing, and then eventually, usually belatedly, the federal government will come in or try to come in with some kind of constitutional amendment. And I'll get to those in a bit. In the early period, in the constitutional period itself, of course, there were some debates about it. Ben Franklin was among the most well-known. And here, but most states in the early period, the 1780s to the 1820s, had property requirements. Franklin, who was the oldest of the framers in Philadelphia and the most progressive, opposed this with this story about which you've now had a chance to read, but basically who, you know, if you can present your jackass as evidence that you meet the property requirements, and then the jackass dies and you can't vote, well, who had the right to vote? You, the man or the jackass? That story was so well known that I actually came across references in state constitutional debates from, you know, like states like Ohio from the 1840s. By the way, this is recommended reading if you're insomniac. People just references to, you know, saying to Franklin's jackass in passing. Right? So it was sufficiently well known. Anyway, in the early period, which we go back to the, oh, I did it the right way. This early period is a period which is notable for the expansion of the franchise. Property requirements almost everywhere, were eliminated. Taxpayer requirements were dropped. Laws were passed in many states permitting non-citizens to vote, which may surprise us. There's a particular category of non-citizen called basically aliens who have declared their intent to become citizens. There were limits to the exclusions. Racial limits were actually expanded during this period, and only in New England, you know, by the 1830s, only in New England were African Americans allowed to vote. And paupers, meaning people who were dependent on public welfare, were disenfranchised. But still, you know, by 1850, almost all adult white males could vote. That was better than most places, better than it had been. Still pretty restricted. And just a quick comment about something about this was that one peculiarity of this history is that in this period of expansion, no public decision or policy decision was made that self-consciously was saying we need to enfranchise working class people or the peasantry. That's the fights in Europe and in Latin America over who's going to get the right to vote are fights over the working class and the peasantry. Now, why do we not have those fights in the United States? One, our peasantry was enslaved, so it really wasn't a debate. And the interesting part of the history, very relevant to this part of the world in New England, is that in most states in the North, the franchise was expanded before there was much industrialization. So that when people were expanding the franchise in Massachusetts, say in 1820, 1821, or in New York in approximately the same year, they weren't picturing letting factory workers vote. They were picturing letting small farmers vote. And this becomes important for some later rollbacks in the story. It's also relevant to, and see my second quiz question, see if we have another ringer, to the Dorr War. Anybody know what the Dorr War was? Is that a laugh as a yes or a laugh as a who could possibly know what the Dorr War? The Dorr War is there's in Rhode Island. Okay, the Dorr War was a struggle that went on for almost a decade in the state of Rhode Island over the right to vote. War is a little strong. There was an attempt to kind of take control of an arsenal. But in effect, what happened in Rhode Island was that by the time they got around to reforming their charter, and they were still living under the colonial charter even as a state, by the time they got around to reforming it, Rhode Island already had a very significant working class. They had textile workers. They had the largest percentage of its population was textile workers. So that if they had set about really getting rid of all property requirements in Rhode Island, textile workers would have had a political majority in the state. They did not want that. people who ran the state did not want to happen. For a period, there were 2 governments of Rhode Island claiming legitimacy, 2 governors, 2 state legislatures. This went on for about a decade. Nobody was killed, to my knowledge, although it was called a war, and it was actually only settled by a remarkably evasive decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, which worked its way up to the Supreme Court, and the question before the court was whether guarantee of a Republican form of government, which is what our Constitution guarantees to each state a Republican form of government, meant that everybody had to vote, and the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, said, if we don't know, we toss that back to the legislature. The high watermark of voting rights in the 19th century was the 15th Amendment. Let me show you one other thing about the opposition to. It's a kind of conservative opposition to expanding the franchise. Chancellor Kent was the most influential jurist in the United States, and as you can see, he wasn't crazy about the idea of universal suffrage, and his views were widely shared. The high water mark comes just after the Civil War, with the passage of the 15th Amendment, first the 14th Amendment, and then the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment, as you know, and as you can see there, basically banned denying people the right to vote because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That is passed by Congress in the late 1860s. It was ratified by 1870, and I have the second one next. I'll let you read that wording a little bit longer. And then this is the next period of timeline, which, as you can see, gets busy. So picture this: that for the first 2/3 of the 19th century, things are basically expanding. Okay, and then the 15th Amendment is pretty important. It enfranchises black people. Unfortunately, it enfranchised black people only for about a decade. But we'll get to that part of the story. Part of what a major part of U.S. history and the history of voting rights is that after the Civil War, there is a large-scale attack on the expansions of voting rights that have occurred during the first 2/3. Okay, there is a loss of faith in democracy. Let me just skip ahead and give you an example. Francis Parkman, a great historian who ended up with kind of reactionary views, but he was this is his view, basically saying a New England village of the olden time would have been safely and well governed by the votes of every man in it. Again, this is late 1870s, right after the Civil War, large-scale immigration underway. But now that the village has grown into a populous city with its factories and workshops, its acres of tenement houses, and thousands and 10,000s of restless workmen, foreigners for the most part, to whom liberty means license and politics means plunder. Rhetoric sound familiar? To whom the public good is nothing and their own most trivial interest everything. The case is completely changed, and universal suffrage becomes a questionable blessing. That is, I would say, the dominant view of educated public opinion in the United States by the 1870s and the 1880s. The most major expression of this, concrete result of this, takes place in the South, where they're not concerned about the New England village, but they don't like African Americans voting, and they don't like African Americans taking, basically taking charge of some cities and regions in the South. Some of you may have heard about the coup d'etat that took place in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, which I lived in North Carolina for a while, not in 1898, but a century later, and it's only really a century later that the people of eastern North Carolina and Wilmington itself became aware of what had happened there. What had happened was that Wilmington, North Carolina, which if any of you have been to, this is a kind of sleepy entryway to some really good beaches. But Wilmington was a critical port. It was the most important port in that whole region of the coast. And it was a place to which African Americans flocked, a frequent flock. And it had not quite a majority of African American, but close to that. They voted. They were joined by a number of white Republicans. And there was basically a predominantly black, progressive Republican pro-civil rights government that ruled Wilmington and a large chunk of eastern North Carolina for a time in the 1890s. And it was overthrown by an effective military coup of armed men that had been revved up by newspapers. The charge, interesting, was that blacks were armed. In fact, it wasn't Jews, it was actually white people armed. So, I mean, that's an extreme case, but the fact is that by 1900, 1905, only a tiny proportion of African Americans were able to exercise the franchise in the United States. Okay, so that's a pretty well-known story. So on the one hand, the Constitution says you can't discriminate, but they found other ways to discriminate. Right? You can have literacy tests, or you can have understanding clauses. You have to read a portion of the state constitution and explain to an examiner what it means. You had to pretend, for some places, you had to present your tax receipts. You had to prove that you had paid taxes, and present the receipts going back 4 or 5 years. A lot of this was really very clumsy. They did it. It was done, but it wasn't a very efficient way to keep black people from voting. So what happened by early in the 20th century, most states developed a more efficient system, which was to declare that Democratic primaries were not public elections. By 1910, the Republican Party does not exist in the South. Okay? It's a one-party region. And they declared that primaries in the Democratic Party are private affairs, not public elections. And thus the 15th Amendment does not apply. And thus you could have a white primary to choose candidates. And that's what a number of states did. And the Supreme Court approved that twice. And later, 35 years later, it said, no, that was actually not, you really couldn't make a defensive case for that. For 35 years, that was the law. Meanwhile, while that's going on in the South, similar things are happening in the North. And it is aimed at immigrant workers, and who are increasingly, in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, not from English-speaking countries, and who are regarded in the way that Francis Parkman regarded them, as being unworthy and different. Now, here, to just make a quick distinction about something that's worth noting, what happens in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is not, in most cases, outright disenfranchisement. It's voter suppression. Okay, and actually, this is the first period in U.S. history when the term voter suppression or vote suppression appears in print. And in public speech. The difference between them, you may think that's just technical, but given the 15th Amendment, you could not disenfranchise African Americans, right? And in most places, you could not politically disenfranchise white immigrant workers either. And you couldn't pass laws saying everybody born in Italy can't vote. That would not be acceptable. So what voter suppression was and is what you do when you really want to disenfranchise people, but you can't. Which is you put lots of obstacles in their way. You make it difficult for them to vote. You make it difficult for them to register. And this had the effect in north and south. You know, in the south, it just completely winnowed out the black electorate. But in the north, all sorts of tests were put into place. For example, a literacy test did not originate in the south. They originated in the north. One of the early ones was here in Massachusetts. There were poll taxes in the north as well, and very intricate registration requirements that were designed. On the one hand, registration it's something to streamline the process and make sure that the process is secure. But registration rules can put obstacles in the paths of potential voters. For example, in many states during this period, laws were passed requiring people to register every year to vote if they lived in large cities. Okay. In Pennsylvania, you had to register annually if you lived in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, but not anyplace else. In New York, if you lived in New York City, but not anyplace else. My favorite of these specially targeted registration laws was a New York law that was passed in, I think, 1913 and 1914, at a time when the Socialist Party in New York was gaining a lot of strength, particularly in the Jewish community, garment workers living in New York. So that a law was passed, basically a registration law, which you had to register every year if you wanted to vote in New York. And the 2 registration days in New York for a couple of years happened to fall on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, the 2 holidays on which Jews were not supposed to be going and doing things like going out to register. New York State, in fact, just continuing, passes an English language literacy test to vote in 1921. Okay? When we think of New York, New York's a big immigrant property. That disenfranchises lots and lots of people. It's enforced. It remains on the books until 1968. Okay? In the 1960s, it is disenfranchising. One of the weird ironies of this, people who were born in Puerto Rico, an American protectorate, a territory, educated in U.S. government schools, but speaking Spanish, and then moved to New York. Not a trivial number of people by 1965 could not vote in New York. I think what I want to, well, let me move on a little bit here. One other piece of the story, very important piece of the story, and a more, in some sense, optimistic piece of the story during this period, is the movement to enfranchise women. This movement gets seriously launched in the 1850s, and it's passed by Congress and ratified around 1920, with the 19th Amendment. And on the one hand, it is a significant success, and it enfranchises half of the nation's population, which had not been enfranchised before. On the other hand, as this quotation from basically historian participants, it took an awful lot of work to get that to happen over a 70-year period. Male voters didn't suddenly wake up in 1915 and say, man, actually my wife should vote. This fierce campaigns, and referring to a theme that I mentioned last time, it only really passes because of World War I. Eventually, yes. But the agitation of women during World War I, their contribution to the war effort, Woodrow Wilson finally goes to Congress and urges the passage of the 19th Amendment as a, quote, war measure to maintain morale and public support for the war. After 1920, there's a period of about, I'd say maybe 30 years, 40 years, when things are pretty quiet from about roughly the early 1920s until the 1960s. Here's the last timeline. can go into details, but not too much happens between the 1920s and 1960s. But then we move into a third period, which I labeled here a revolutionary transformation of the right to vote. An awful lot happens in this period between 1960 and 1970. It really is a dramatic transformation. People talk about it as the Second American Revolution. Politically, and it happens on a number of different fronts. There are Supreme Court decisions. If I can walk over here without stumbling. Baker versus Carr and Reynolds versus Sims. These are not about voting rights itself, but they are about democracy. These are the Supreme Court decisions which basically state that districts, congressional and legislative districts, have to have the same number of people in them. Okay? That was not the law of the land until the 1960s, and it wasn't like there were minor diversions. Okay? Los Angeles County had the same number, which had something like 1 million people in 1950, had the same number of state senators and members of the state house as Shasta County, which had like 17 people. There are deformations all over the place. Harper versus Virginia is another Supreme Court decision. And it says basically that having financial requirements to vote is unconstitutional. That's the first time that is made federal law. Separating your economic well-being from the right to vote. It happens in 1966. And then, of course, the Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965. And the Voting Rights Act is, this is a quiz question, which I know you won't know the answer to, but just in case. Anybody have any idea what the subtitle of the Voting Rights Act is? You get 3 brownies and the subtitle is, and it's worthy of note, is an act to enforce the 15th Amendment. Okay? The 15th Amendment had been passed a century earlier. The Enforcement Act takes a century. Okay? It's a remarkable little fact. And what the Voting Rights Act did was basically to send federal marshals in to make sure that black people could get registered to vote and could exercise their right to vote. And it created the pre-clearance provision, which some of you may know about. But what the pre-clearance provision said was that in any state with a history of discrimination, any state with jurisdiction, state or county, with a history of discrimination, before that jurisdiction makes any changes to voting laws or to election laws of any sort, including districting, it has to get those changes approved by either the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department or a federal court in Washington. Okay? The reason why the pre-clearance provision was passed was people, knew how the system worked and knew that if you were, for example, a white majority or white minority in a town and you wanted to stay in power, but now you have to let black people vote, well, you could still control the city council, but depending on deciding how large the city council would be. Would members be elected at large or by district? So making any changes like that had to be approved basically by the federal government to make sure that they did not have discriminatory intent or discriminatory consequences. It was an absolutely key feature of the Voting Rights Act, and it was declared unconstitutional in Shelby versus Holder in 2013, and it no longer exists in a lot of what we have seen in the last almost decade has been a consequence of the absence of the pre-clearance provision. Going back to what I said originally about state versus federal, the pre-clearance mechanism was a critical mechanism for guaranteeing something that looked like federal uniformity or federal supervision of voting rights laws. And it is now gone. But, you know, in this earlier period, I mean, the shape of the U.S. electorate shifts dramatically between 1960, or maybe even a little bit earlier, and into the 1970s. And one, you know, one other way to refer to that would be to say that, putting aside the politics and people's changing values, the electorate of 1965 would never have elected Barack Obama. One of the other changes that happens, by the way, is the age of voting. The age of citizenship drops from 21 to 18, which is a result of the Vietnam War, or the protests against the Vietnam War. Let me then draw these patterns and talk about the present. The historical pattern of the late 19th and early 20th century is that there's an expansion of voting rights for African Americans, immigrant workers, etc. And then there's a huge reaction against that, which produces very significant disenfranchisement. Not everybody, but it produces very significant disenfranchisement. What we have been living through in the United States for the last couple of decades is a very similar dynamic. What you see in U.S. history after the Voting Rights Act and a number of other measures were passed in the 1960s and into the early 1970s is a tremendous expansion of African American political power and African American political influence. I mean, you know, Barack Obama was elected, Kamala Harris was elected, but you see it at, you know, at many other levels as well. There's been a major increase in African American power. It has also been a period of extremely high rates of immigration. For the first time, rivaling the rates of immigration that existed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What we are seeing in the battles over the franchise now, this year, last year, really since over the last decade, is a reaction against those two major forces, against black empowerment and the empowerment of an increasingly large number of immigrants. I think, you know, part of, you know, now, on the one hand, one could say, okay, well, that's comforting, it's happened before, and maybe there's some comfort to be found there. I mean, there's certainly a way the patterns are very similar. It's not so comforting if you think about the fact that the last wave of big reaction against the universal suffrage led to the disenfranchisement of black people for 3/4 of a century, or at least half a century, depending on exactly where we were. And it took shutting off immigration in 1924, and then basically letting the immigrant generation itself sort of fade or become less numerous, make immigrants less significant a presence in the society for that particular kind of exclusion to become less active. So it is a sobering story with clear patterns in our history. And again, and there are many. I'm doing the broad strokes. There are lots of individual state stories here. You know, in Minnesota, they don't let people who work in the lumber industry vote for a while because they're believed to be Finnish radicals of one sort or another. But let me make a couple of concluding remarks and then open this up to discussion. I think, you know, in addition to looking at the social forces that are at work here, and those are the things that I referred to, I don't think the issue will ever be fully settled, the issue of voting rights and how universal they are, without putting the right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. I just think it's a matter of policy. We need it. It's been very difficult to do. I have drafted several versions of such amendments, and 12, 14 years ago, I was working with a group of members of Congress. We actually had 55 co-sponsors in the House for a right to vote amendment. But this is a list of the amendments that have been passed. But Republican opposition even 10, 15 years ago was absolutely ferocious. If there was a right to vote in the Constitution, then a lot of these laws which trim away at it would probably not survive constitutional scrutiny. And that's the real value. It's not just declaring that everybody has a right to vote. It's saying that if you pass a procedural law that burdens that right, you can't do that. And we say we shouldn't be surprised by the extent of these recent conflicts. If we understand our own history, we shouldn't be surprised, which isn't to say that we should welcome these conflicts or just be accepting of them, but they are not coming out of the blue, they're coming out of something deep in both the social history and the constitutional history of the United States. Let me add two final comments here about your right to vote, about voting rights in presidential elections, which are a little different. You don't have any right to vote in presidential elections, not according to the federal constitution. Your only right to vote in the presidential election comes if your state legislature. I mean, the way the U.S. Constitution reads, the line at the top of this side is each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. Okay, that's what the U.S. Constitution says about the choice of presidential elector. In such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. Okay. If the legislature says we're going to choose electors ourselves, it can do that. Okay. That was the case in the first 30, 40 years of our history. State legislatures chose electors by themselves. Very, very frequently. In the 2000 election, there was a question about whether Florida's Republican-controlled legislature was going to do that, to guarantee that Bush would get the state's electoral votes. Now, there is a limit on this, but I mention this in part because this is resurfacing as a very live issue, which is that most state constitutions have provisions that say that electors for presidential elections shall be chosen in popular elections. And the legislature can't just override the state constitution. But, in effect, what I'm saying is your right to vote for president is even weaker than all other, and potentially more jeopardized. And at the last 6 months, there has appeared this kind of wacko theory, that's the technical called it's basically a doctrine of independent state legislatures, which says that state legislatures can do whatever they want to do with respect to electoral procedures and voting rights, that they don't even have to adhere to their own state constitutions. And this would permit various moves. For example, suppose that there were, I think, a random example that the state of Georgia had a disputed presidential election vote in 2024. Wisconsin could be similar. And it would buttress the ability of the Georgia or Wisconsin state legislature to say, the popular vote isn't very clear, so we're just going to intervene and choose electors by ourselves, and we have absolutely no right to do that. That has been lurking out there for a while in quasi-constitutional history, and I think that is an issue that's going to become very live in the next possibly 2 to 3 years, certainly. So I've run on a little bit, sorry. But let me open this up for discussion, questions about either anything I've said or voting rights in general, or if you want to stray into January 6th, I can do that.
Yeah, we seem to be very polarized these days, and I wonder how you rank us in historical terms. Are we at a high water mark or where?
I don't think we're at an absolute high water mark. We did have a civil war. That's not a lot of, you know, that's a high bar. You have to pass that. Let me make a couple of comments there. I mean, I don't think, the polarization is somewhat asymmetric. The hatred is symmetric, or the antagonism is hatred. Polarization often implies that, like the two major political parties have each gone to their extremes, and I don't think that that's really true. I think it's an asymmetric polarization. But the intensity of antagonism is, I think, the two periods that are pointed to, or one was a period, obviously, the Civil War, but the other was in the early decades of the Republic. The Federalists and the Republicans around 1800 really hated. They really hated each other. They did not believe the other faction should exist. And basically thought that each side basically thought that the other side should be locked up and the key should be thrown away. Which is not too far, I think, from attitudes that exist today. I think that what we have today is scarier than many other instances of extreme partisan antagonism, because since the 1980s, we have had the parties are no longer very ideologically divided. It used to be the old parties that some of us people in this room were hairs almost as gray as mine remember, was when there was a liberal wing of the Republican Party and a conservative wing of the Republican Party, and there were similar wings of the Democratic. The Democratic Party was this weird anomaly of Southern racists and New York liberals, what we have now is a national political party that is dominated by the sentiment, by I think a disrespect for electoral procedures, and a lack of confidence in and disrespect, as well as disrespect for institutions. So that's a long answer to saying that. Again, we had a civil war, but this is I find this to be a very scary set of circumstances.
Thank you so much to the Scituate Friends of Public Library for hosting this event, and to you for sharing your time and wisdom with us personally. Very much appreciated. But I am so curious. I think you've given a lot of context to all of the things that have led up to January 6th, and I'm really curious about your thoughts on this and your commentary, because I'm still totally at a loss about not so much anymore, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts.
Let me begin by making a comment between the difference. I've taught this course now almost twice, and we're most of the way through. When I taught it starting in late January 2021, which is to say weeks after the event, all of the attention, a lot of the attention in the class, and but most of the news media attention, maybe people were talking about it, it was focused on the people who had actually invaded the Capitol, right? The emblem were, the guy was antlers, when people walking around with Confederate flags, or people bashing windows, a lot of scary stuff. But that was where the focus was. Over the course of the last year, the focus has really shifted. And it's now on the White House. And people close close to the White House. I think that what, I mean, and I've also been, you know, everybody with, I was going to say a typewriter, but nobody uses typewriters. A laptop who has any proximity to the events has now written a book about it. And I think that what we witnessed in November, December, early January of 2020, 2021 was a multi-pronged, coordinated, clumsy and not very well thought out, complicated strategy to overturn an election by people who actually knew better. Maybe people who knew that former President Trump had lost the election. But I think it was the people who invaded the Capitol do not look so much like the primary actors anymore. They look like people who were summoned into place. Fuses were lit. I mean, you know, we now have, as of last night, one of the leaders of the Proud Boys has said that he's going to testify on it, and we'll learn more from that. But I think that one of the first questions I asked the class when we first met, 3 weeks after the event, was what do we call this event? Is it a coup d'etat? Is it a riot? What's the language? And there's a lot of uncertainty about that. I wasn't sure about it myself. I think that what we saw was something that looked like an attempt at coup d'etat. I mean, it was amateurish in a lot of ways, right? I mean, they could have gotten better lawyers. Losing 62 cases out of 63 suggests there's something wrong with your legal strategy. Anyway, that's like
It's interesting what you said, that after a war, democracy starts to accelerate.
during or after, yeah.
And this thing here, like, I think Trump miscalculated, or whoever was doing it miscalculated and thought the left would show up. But the left were all in their houses because of COVID. And I think if the left had showed up, we would be having a civil war. I think that he would have called martial law and he would still be in the White House. And then the same miscalculation is happening in Ukraine, where they didn't expect to run into the human ability to say, I'll die before you'll do this. And I think that stopped them. So my question was, why did you say that about war? And then the last thing I want to ask you is, mandatory voting is being, thrown around. What do you think about that?
I co-authored that piece in the Globe about 8 weeks ago, mandatory voting. So let me. There are several pieces to your question, and I never really forget one or two of them sort of like. The reason why I say war, I mean, if you look at the pattern of legislative or constitutional expansions of the right to vote, the movement to get rid of property and tax requirements, it takes root during the War of 1812. That's not a war we think about a lot. But basically what happened was that we had to muster sort of all sorts of people into the army to fight Britain. And those people came together, and they were living together, and they did this incredible thing. They began talking to each other, like, how come most of us don't have the right to vote because we're not property owners, but they want us to come out here and get killed by the British? And that set in motion a set of political movements which in less than a decade overturned many of the property and tax requirements. The Civil War leads to the 14th and 15th Amendments. The World War I leads to the 19th Amendment. The Cold War, in many ways you could argue, is a competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union is part of what leads to what happens in the 1960s. Racial discrimination in the U.S. was an issue that the Soviet Union made a lot of noise about, aimed at African countries or Asian countries. Latin Americans. And look at the way they treat their black people. So that's the war story. In terms of, if you think that Trump expected the left to go out into the streets and then do something that could lead to a situation where he could have called.
We didn't get the message, the promotion didn't get to us. We didn't realize the
It's interesting to think about. I don't know. What I do know from some of these books that have been written is that the highest ranks of our military seemed very alert to some stuff. They knew, and they were pretty determined not to let anything really happen. We still don't know about some of this stuff, about who at the Pentagon blocked sending the National Guard, and I mean, there's still some murky things, but it seems very clear that General Milley, for example, was very, very clued in and alert, and did not want a coup d'etat to happen on his watch.
And Trump was sitting there waiting for someone to fight, and all he got was a guy backing up with a baton.
Yeah, no,
It did not work out well for him.
And I think, in terms of, your allusion to Ukraine, certainly in Ukraine, we seem to have a situation where a political leader, Putin, not simply a matter of miscalculations, but a set of his fantasies about how the world works and who is who, has inflicted terrible, terrible damage. It's going to be interesting to me, as a citizen, but to see whether the upshot of this in the Western world strengthens pro-democratic actors or not. I think that as was true during World War II gave a huge burst to democracy, right? In ideological strength. This may be doing something similar, although maybe not. I don't know. Did Marie Le Pen win the first round today, by the way?
Your comment about the military I found very interesting. That respects January 6th. At least explicitly or implicitly is suggesting that that civil power is very much dependent on what the military leadership decides. At least that was the case in January 6th. And that's a very familiar thing across the world. And it's troubling to think we may be, if whoever it was in the Pentagon at the time decided that, maybe Trump wasn't so bad, we ought to keep him, that maybe we still have him. It seems to be at least suggesting that. The other thing that occurs to me is that I think that the riots I read about history, I think of the attack on the Bastille, for example, they've not been that well organized. And there's been a lot in the Arab Spring and other more recent things where, so a lot of regime change things by mobs have not been that well organized. And I don't know whether we should expect our mobs to be better organized, and by them not being organized, say, well, don't worry.
No, it's a very good point. And it's always easy to look back on a kind of failed mob event, say, they were chaotic and disorganized, and to draw then the conclusion, unless they weren't really a threat, right? So I think your point is well taken. Despite that, I think that the mob, we want to use that as a term, people who invaded the Capitol. Let me try to state this as best I can. I think there was a kind of coup d'etat in a way. I don't think the people who invaded the Capitol thought that that's necessarily that that's what they were doing, or they didn't know how to do it. Okay, you know, what role, because if you think about it, their role is quite indirect. Their role was to try to mess things up for a while, to then permit some members, you know, of Congress to vote in such a way as to then send things back to the state. It wasn't a very direct and clear goal. And one of the signs, or one of the things which has always struck me as mysterious, and I'm trying to get some students to work on this a little bit, is that the event at the Capitol dissolved very quickly, right? It was still going on. It starts at, you know, early in the afternoon, etc. But then by 4 or 5 o'clock, you know, once they had sent in some more people, everybody left. That doesn't sound like the kind of thing people were making a revolution. They, you know, people left. They didn't even arrest anybody there. But I mean, but it was just people left. They dissolved. They went away. The Capitol was clear, and there's very little report about people resisting being evicted. Right? We see lots of footage of people breaking in, but almost nothing about people resisting being evicted. So,
to what extent do you think that the current efforts of voter suppression that you read about will influence the next couple of elections?
it's a good question, and I don't know the answer. It's very difficult to tell, to measure what the impact is of laws like that, because basically when it goes down to it, you're setting up to try to measure it, it's kind of, how do you measure why someone did not do something? You know, there are a lot of reasons why people may not vote in the next election. And how can you tell which ones are due to the voter suppression? So it's a difficult thing to measure. And there's some evidence from past elections that that mobilizing, that groups get involved, get organized in mobilizing people to vote when there are these suppressive measures, and that compensates or more than compensates for the actual suppressive measures. So I think we don't know. I don't think that the impact will be particularly large in either direction. Even a small impact could turn an election. What I'm more concerned about, at least this week, is the laws that are being passed that are putting partisan figures in charge of election administration and the counting of ballots. You know, that's one or two people in the wrong places can really have an impact there. You know, it's you know, I don't know that this name will ring the line, but all hail to Aaron von Langerveld. Aaron von Langerveld. I talk about him in a lot of public appearances because I just think there should be a grassroots movement to make him a national hero. He was a Republican member of the Michigan Board of Canvassers, who, a young lawyer, sort of not particularly ambitious, you know, decent guy, under immense amount of pressure, and he voted to certify the Michigan electoral vote. He has since been removed from his position, but Aaron von Langerveld, you know, just played it straight.
So what about mandatory voting?
Oh yeah, mandatory voting. I guess my headline is, I favor it. I think it would be difficult to get it passed. You know, the history in this state, you know, it's one of my colleagues, Miles Rappaport and E.J. Dion, have just done this book called 100% Voting. And then Miles and I did a piece for the Globe, which came out sometime, I think, in January, about the Massachusetts story there. Massachusetts Constitution has a provision, an enabling provision, saying that the legislature can implement mandatory voting. you know, I think that changing the culture around elections, I mean, you know, I'm basically in favor. I think the election day should be a holiday as well. I think it should be a day that's kind of a celebration of democracy, not a day when you're kind of scampering to get your kid home from daycare, and then you know, and also stop, you know, and vote. So I think that whatever we can do to enhance a sense of civic participation and culture is a good thing. And so I would favor it, but I expect there will be very significant resistance.
I'd be curious, leading off of that, you know, every election will always be comments about turnout and low voter turnout and so on, and how much of that lack of participation and low turnout do you think is due to people having difficulty voting versus apathy versus lack of education? Is that something that people have really tried to untangle? Because I know everyone likes to trot that figure out and say, well, only so many percent came out to vote.
Explaining turnout in elections has been a kind of non-trivial industry among political scientists for the last 30 or 40 years. And people keep each other in business by coming up with arcane findings that prove that X is not true and Y or Y is true. My own view about this is that I think that voter apathy, or in the sense of people deciding that they don't think it's worth it for them to vote, is a much more important factor than voter suppression. But I think we're going to go a step further, which is, well, why do people think that? And I think that people think that because they think that that neither political party is going to do anything much that's going to benefit them. You know, and we do have, you know, another cottage industry of political scientists, which actually has produced more consistent results. You know, it's about whose views really matter to legislators, right? And it's very clear that that Congress, and it's also true in the states, responds to people with a lot of money and not to people with less money. And, you know, just that's the positions adopted by the wealthy and powerful are the positions most likely to lead the legislative analysis. So I think that, I guess I think apathy may not quite be the right word because it implies a kind of, you know, almost kind of character flaw, and I don't think it's a character flaw. I think partly it's that the choices are not going to matter too much for most people. And so that's, again, I think that we're tying it into another question. I mean, you're mandatory voting, you start shifting around the political culture, and people might think that that it might matter. I mean, you know, the other thing which happens in the conduct of modern politics, which is pernicious, I think, and which is related, which is that political parties and political candidates stress issues which they think will appeal to those people who have a high propensity to vote, right? You know, that's where the soccer moms came from, right? They all voted, so their concerns were, and you know, and then of course what that means is that the issues that are relevant to a number of other people, whose past histories that they don't vote, which means that primarily they're poor and less educated, those issues don't get put on the table. There's a hand in the back.
So I'm really glad that you mentioned that because I'm from a state with a very high African American population, and a large percentage of that population tends not to vote in the elections. But it's very much because of disenfranchisement, not apathy, I don't think. And I just want to know how can we reach, you know, those people? How can we let them know that their vote really will matter and make a difference?
I think one thing we have to do is, well, you know, I think, you know, one thing that has to be done is to make it the case that their vote will matter. Now, again, I mean, you know, I detect a certain political drift in this group, so that I don't think we talk actually about it. You know, how to make Breitbart more effective. Am I reading the room right? But you know, I think that one of the ironies of the Trumpist movement is that it has brought home to a lot of people that it matters. And, you know, turnout, but it matters on both sides. I mean, turnout was high in the last presidential election. Whether it will stay that way, I don't, you know, it's so hard to read because on the one hand, you know, people are getting, the message is that, you know, they're poles apart, right, between the two political parties. And if you're a black person, it's that you have good reason to be scared about certain kinds of outcomes. On the other hand, the messages are pouring out that the elections aren't honest, they're fraudulent. Your votes are not going to be counted right. So how this is all going to play, if I had a crystal ball.
Let's get back to control of the voting. Given that the frame is compromised and gave control of voting to the states only to keep states together, otherwise they would dissolve. And now we have a Supreme Court controlled by originalists who support the right of the states to have control. How does that get undone? How does anything change if everything goes to the Supreme Court and the originalists don't accept that could be any change?
You have to bring up awkward little thing to the Supreme Court. I don't know how it is. This Supreme Court is not sympathetic to voting rights. And John Roberts is not, who maybe is now sort of, maybe the swing vote on the court, I don't know. He's on some issues, but not on voting rights. He has had a pretty crabbed and narrow view of what the appropriate role of federal government should be. So I don't know how we get there. I think that one avenue to change is for some significant political change to happen in certain states that might tilt the balance, on some things and possibly lead in a direction towards a more expansive view of voting rights. And let me be less abstract about that. I think Georgia and Texas are two very interesting places to watch. Again, I've written a book about the Electoral College, which you also asked me about. If I were a Republican in Georgia right now, I might be really raising some questions about the practice of allocating electoral votes on a winner-take-all basis. Okay? And I might, if I were, if I were in Georgia, I might be looking at the fact that if I were a Republican in Georgia, that I might be sort of in a narrow minority and might want to protect certain kinds of procedures for myself. And in Texas, I can tell a similar, a little more complicated story. But I don't see a path. For example, I read stuff. A lot of people who work overlaps with mine are election law experts, legal academics, and or practitioners who do election law. And I don't see a lot of optimism there about legal strategies for making things more open and more inclusive.
What's your take on ranked choice voting? On what?
Ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is a system where you don't just go in and vote for one person, but but you rank your candidates. And I like it. Look, ranked choice voting, and there are a number of different ways you can set it up. You know, one thing it does is to permit. It seems likely to produce outcomes that will have candidates who are not at the extremes, and to have candidates who are, and people elected to office who generally have more, public support. I live in a city that has ranked choice voting for the city council and the school committee, and it's really a nuisance. You're expecting a voter to really have and absorb. It's just in Cambridge, for example, there's a 9-member city council. City council elections, you can vote for, I forget, you can vote for everybody. You're expecting voters to have a lot of information in order to provide a ranked choice ballot about 9 candidates. So whether things can be modified in some way to get rid of that nuisance quality. But our electoral system of having single-member districts and quotes first past the post, which is whoever gets most votes, even if it's not a majority. It's a system that is not very good at bringing new people into politics or injecting new ideas.
There've been efforts on the way for a long time to get rid of the electoral system. In about 15 states have voted so far to do that.
You mean the electoral college?
Pardon?
You mean the electoral college?
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yes, where do you think that effort is going? I know there are efforts in a lot of states.
Okay, for those of you who don't know, and everybody happen to know what the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is? I'm shocked. That's what this gentleman is referring to. This is an effort which got launched in 2006. And it is it's a kind of Rube Goldberg way to get rid of the electoral college. It basically calls for the creation of an interstate compact. I'm doing background, so then I can answer your questions so people will know what I'm responding to. It's the creation of an interstate compact that states can sign on to. This state, by the way, has signed on to it, although nobody knows it, and that's part of the problem with the compact. States, meaning state legislatures, can sign onto this interstate compact. And they sign on to the compact, and when they sign on, they say they will count their electoral votes for whoever wins the national popular vote, not the popular vote of the state. And the compact will take effect only when states with a total of 270 electoral votes, which is what's needed to win, have signed on. It was a very ingenious idea. I actually supported it, sort of, but I did support it publicly at the outset. It worked up a lot of steam, and by a few years ago, I had 15 states plus DC signed on to it. I guess I'll make 2 comments about it. One is that I no longer support it, so that means it's but I a number of years ago began thinking that it was opening up the possibility of gaming the system, because and I knew this people like, but I don't want to dwell on it. The fact is, if a state can join a compact, but it doesn't have to stay in the compact. It can leave the compact. You can't do it in a certain period of elections, but it can leave the compact. So that seems to me to invite a kind of chaos where you could have states joining and not joining, and you could have one electoral system, one election, another. So that was, so, and I think that's a pretty powerful criticism. Although John Toza, who's the creator of this compact, who made a great deal of money that he's been using to finance this quite expensive campaign, he intervened to scratch off lottery ticket, so you can see. Anyway, Toza gets mad at me when I make comments about it. But the second point is that I think that if there's one thing that the 2020 election and its aftermath taught us, is that election methods and procedures have to be as simple and transparent as possible. They should not be complicated, it should not vary and have arcane rules from one state to another or third. What the National Popular Voting Interstate Compact does is to take all of the complexity that already exists in the Electoral College and add another level of complexity and confusion. And I think that's a mistake.
So what do you think about same-day registration?
I basically am in favor of it. I mean, I think that we haven't been. I don't think that the worry that it's a security, from that will get flooded with people who are not legitimate. It's really much of a worry in this technology. And I think that things that that make it easier for people to register. And they understand that people often don't get focused on voting and go pretty close to the election. So I'm in favor of that. I'd be happy to hear your view as well.
Well, it's hard to administer by the clerks, and we could say at least show up 5 days ahead of time and make things a lot easier.
Yeah, I know, and I think and I think that with a number of things, the kind of groovy ideas of reformers have bumped into very reality-based complaints from the clerks and people who have to administer these things. And I think that that's kind of taken very seriously.
Anything else?
Sure. What?
It's up to you, but I mean.
Oh yeah, no, that's right. I'm Universe money. I can take more questions. Let me actually expand my answer to that. It's not just about registration. Kinds of reforms that might be possible. For example, one of the other big issues that's around is voter ID, right? And having to, do you have to show a recent, current government-issued ID in order to vote, as opposed to being here in Massachusetts, where you just have to show up in your sneakers. And having a voter ID requirement is very popular in Poland. People think that you should have to have an ID, and it's being used in many suppressive ways. But there would be an approach to having to voter ID, which would be to say, if you show up at the polls and don't have a voter ID, you get to cast a provisional ballot, which we know we can cast if you need to, but beyond the provisional ballot, while you're at the polls, you can apply for an ID by showing up there. Now, that is administratively messy, right? But it's a feasible problem, and it would also bring us closer to the point where I think we should be, which is that I don't have objections to voter ID requirements. I think it should be the responsibility of the state or the national government to provide the ID. It shouldn't be up to the individual having to schlep somewhere. Again, around here, it's up to, there are places where to get an ID means you have to travel 70 miles. And the fact that you need an ID means you don't have a driver's license. So you can't drive for 70 miles. You're in charge.
Is there one last question? Thank you all.
Thank you.